Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Unlocking Business Potential Through Accessibility virtual workshop in partnership with the University of Windsor EPICentre. My name is Jennifer Brignall-Strong from WEtech Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's session. Here at WEtech Alliance, our goal is to make valuable community connections and provide you with relevant content and workshop opportunities to help you improve efficiencies and scale your business. Today, we are celebrating the 12th annual Global Accessibility Awareness Day, a day designed to get everyone talking, thinking, and learning about digital access and inclusion and the more than 1 billion people with disabilities or impairments. In this session, our expert will explore the benefits of improving accessibility for your company and how it can unlock business potential. We will learn about best practices for making workplaces more accessible, along with real-world examples of successful accessibility initiatives. Before we begin, just a few logistic details. If you have any questions for our guest, you may submit questions at any time through the session using the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your display window. You can also upvote any question that you want answered. If you have any technical difficulties at any point, please send us a message in the chat inbox and we'll be sure to try to help you out. And lastly, this presentation is being recorded. A video file, audio file, and relevant links will be all available on WEtech's YouTube channel. If you would like to learn more about Global Accessibility Awareness Day, you can log on to accessibility.day. Now I'd like to introduce Leanne Barakat, the Marketing Administrative Assistant for EPICentre, to tell us a little bit more about EPICentre and our workshop facilitator.
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me take a second to quickly introduce myself. My name is Leanne Barakat, and I'm the Marketing Administrative Assistant at the University of Windsor EPICentre. The EPICentre is the entrepreneurial hub on the University of Windsor campus, serving as a catalyst for transforming ideas into successful ventures. Providing a supportive environment and a wealth of resources, the EPICentre empowers individuals to develop their entrepreneurial skills, turn their ideas to reality, and contribute to economic growth and societal advancement. In addition to educational initiatives, EPICentre provides comprehensive support for startups and early stage ventures. EPICentre equips entrepreneurs with the tools they need to thrive in the competitive business landscape, from incubation services and co-working space to providing access to funding opportunities and mentorship networks. Today, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, David Best. David lost his vision in his teen years due to glaucoma, but went on to obtain a software engineering degree. He started working with Air Canada and has recently retired from IBM Canada. However, he continued working as an entrepreneur, supporting small and medium-sized businesses with best practice digital accessibility communication practices. In his spare time, he enjoys traveling, meeting people, hiking and canoeing, and reading biographies and fiction. As an accessibility IT specialist with over 35 years of working experience in software design and development, project management, diversity leadership, and disability advocacy, David is persistent in seeking accessibility business best practice solutions. Recently retired from IBM, David is now an entrepreneur actively supporting Ontario organizations with accessibility awareness. As an information technology specialist, an accessibility consultant, a digital inclusion advocate, and an assistive technology user, David has experienced the digital divide, confronted workplace challenges, implemented best practice inclusion strategies, mentored peer support group initiatives, facilitated web design workshops, and promoted emerging technologies that inspire independence and confidence. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us on this special day of accessibility. Accessibility can be a very complicated and difficult thing to understand, but it doesn't have to be. And I guess I should start sharing my screen so that I can show you the information that I have. Okay. Whoops. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to start by a bit of a disclaimer here. I do web development a little bit, and I help organizations with accessibility testing. And I really appreciate designers and developers creating their websites that are accessible to audio tactile mechanisms such as screen readers. And I appreciate it because I understand the challenges in trying to make the website accessible to everybody. I have the same problem in trying to make websites visually appealing and visually understandable. The cascading style web sheets are not easy to use. And quite often I create a web page that I think is really cool, but it's great for screen reader users and keyboard users, but people that are photon dependent often tell me that the website is messy and unable to understand the content. So I appreciate the efforts that organizations go into in developing a best practice strategy of accessibility. Accessibility doesn't have to be a challenge, okay? If you understand the goals of your business and you have set the values, accessibility becomes second nature. There's two strategies for developing the accessibility. One is right off the starting line. When you're a startup entrepreneur, it's best to develop that accessibility strategy right from the start. However, if you're upscaling, you can go through the transition period, and transitioning can be a challenge. It's a matter of changing processes and attitudes and culture within the organization, but it can be done. So there's two challenges that entrepreneurs have. When I read reports about business startups in Canada, I find that there's two challenges. One is that people have a hard time finding the talent, the acquisition of talent and skills that are needed in the business. And the second thing is reaching markets, reaching larger markets. And with an accessibility strategy, both of these challenges can be bridged. So the first bridge that you want to challenge is understanding the market that you want to go to. You want to make products available and obtainable, affordable, and you have to understand the user's goal. What is the goal of consumers when they want to access your products and services? So in this presentation, I'm going to only go through the first phase. The first step is awareness, and we're going to talk about awareness. And after this, I hope that you will engage the community and partners and take action, because accessibility is an action. And the second stage is engagement, and then exploration, and then your resolution. So we're only going to look at the awareness. As we go through the presentation here, there's three basic definitions that I want to make sure you understand. So design is the bridge that overcomes all of the barriers that you will encounter with regard to communications and diversity. And there's 2 points to that bridge. There's the user interface and the user experience. So in the user interface, it's more like the infrastructure, the talent you need, the materials. Today, we want everything as wireless. We want miniaturization, and we want cloud-based. The user experience is the key that often gets left behind. And I'm going to be talking about this mostly. And the 3 pillars are performance, security, and accessibility. So accessibility today is a measurement of productivity. Maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was seen as an accommodating feature for people with disabilities, but accessibility today is really a mainstream feature that you have to understand and build into your best practice strategies. So the interface that you need to consider is the infrastructure, which is the design standards that you will use for developing communications. The perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust that we'll talk about. At the other end of the bridge is the user experience, and you need to understand what the user wants. And quite often in today's society, we want ubiquitous. We want everything to work right off the bat. We don't want to wait for things to boot up. Intuitive, we don't have time to read manuals and instructions. And adaptable, we want to be able to access your communications from our desktop or while we're on the go in the car or traveling. Finally, the third component of this bridge is the usability component. And in this, we're going to look at what the infrastructure needs to be from a human rights perspective: dignity, independence, integration, and equality. And the user experience at the very end of the bridge, we have efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. Everybody likes to be satisfied. So what are the barriers? Barrier basically is anything that prevents you from doing what you want to do. So if there's anybody on this call that is not aging, and you can guarantee you'll never get a illness or a temporary illness or a temporary accident, or if you'll never encounter an environmental situation that will limit your activities, I would sure like to meet you, because disability is really just a human limitation, and everybody has some sort of limitation. I don't know, I'm sure that you probably tried to drive west on the 401 in a late summer evening with right into the sunset. And you know how challenging that can be. So limitations affect us at different points of our life and at different abilities. The other thing is barriers. What is a barrier? If you want to build a bridge, there's got to be a barrier. What's the point of building it? So if you want to get from Windsor over to Detroit, you build a bridge, you go over the bridge. And there's 5 basic barriers that we have to deal with in the business world. One is attitudes, which is the #1 barrier that we seem to struggle with. Buildings and our communications and information is what I'm going to focus on. Technology, and the second biggest one is systemic. Quite often we have organizations say they have diversity and inclusion, but when you get right down to it, the user experience isn't there. You know, next time you go to a conference, look around. You know, they say 1 out of 5 Canadians has a disability. If you look around the conference room and see how many people you see that have a white cane or a guide dog or in a wheelchair, if you don't see anybody or very few, then you know there's a systemic barrier, because the organization obviously wants diversity and inclusion. So what do you do to build your best practice? Well, Lee Iacocca said that if you have a great idea, it doesn't do you any good unless you can communicate it. So in the first phase of your startup is the inspiration phase, where you have to get your idea out there, talk about it, and figure out what you can do. The ideation phase, you start implementing models, you start engaging people. And then the implementation phase, you hopefully, when you get to market, it's a success. Okay, so the design is something that has to be thought about. It's not something that just happens. You can't do it through goodwill and best intentions. You got to take action. And the biggest mistake that people make is that accessibility is all about disabilities, but in fact, it's really digital communications is really about communicating your big idea. And the accessibility challenges of today are really the mainstream achievements for tomorrow, because I can remember back in university, back in the 70s, we worked with setting up the first computer braille research facility. And I worked with research innovators at that time with GPS tracking, with text to speech, with optical character recognition. And at that time, the digital revolution was just taking off with the price of silicone chips coming down and PCs coming out. And it was quite an exciting time. And when you look at it, a lot of the research and development started as a innovation for a limitation. So Alexander Graham Bell developed the phone to help deaf people hear better. And today everybody's got a phone. Pellegrino Thierry in Italy developed the typewriter for a blind friend to write legibly. And in the early 1930s, the first audio book was produced for blind people through the American Foundation for the Blind. And today, Audible Books is a $1 billion business. So there is a lot of technology that we use today and take for granted that has its roots in the disability community in helping to augment limitations. So there's basically 4 groups, possibly 5. Vision, you can have low vision, you can be totally blind, and there's a large number of people that have colored blindness. So they say about 10% of men are color blind. And when crossing through a major intersection, that's a scary thought. The second one is hearing. Anything from low hearing to total deafness. Everybody experiences that at some point when you're in a noisy environment, a restaurant. Mobility is about physical movement, such as a hand tremor, not able to use the mouse properly, or possibly someone who's paralyzed and uses a wheelchair or walker. Cognitive loss is something that we're learning more and more about. It's something we don't understand that much. It's invisible disability, but can be seen through things like dyslexia or maybe autism. The aging population is a big market, and you don't want to exclude the aging population from your business plan. So consider the limitations that disabilities bring to people when you're developing your best practice. So I don't know how many people in the local area can remember the old Peabody Bridge at the east end of Windsor. I can remember as a kid just loving to go over it at high speed. It's a bridge that had a twist at the top, and if you weren't prepared and going too fast, it could be disastrous. And that's the way a lot of our design is when it comes to digital communications. We're trying to bridge a barrier, but we only get halfway there because we get all the infrastructure, all the technology done, but we forget about the user experience. And there's probably, 96% you can probably solve if you just do the basic things, such as low contrast, missing alt text on images helps people who can't see the image, but it also helps search engines. Empty links can be annoying, and especially forms. If you have forms and you have an input and I have no idea what I'm supposed to type in the input, it can be frustrating. And then you press submit and it says error, and you don't know where the error is. And buttons that have nothing, or they're just a picture. And the biggest one that I find amazing is the number of websites that don't have a language indicator. In Canada, where we have 2 official languages, English and French, when you have a website and you have English and French on it, you have to have a language indicator, because screen readers read text the way us humans try to read it. And if I have my screen reader running and it's reading and all of a sudden it comes to a French section, it doesn't know that. It thinks it's still French. So the biggest challenge that you have in building your best practice strategies is reaching marginalized markets, those hard to reach markets, and putting information in multiple formats. So productivity is a key point, because you want to make sure your procurement people understand what accessibility is. And when you buy a tool, whether it's human resources or a development tool, you got to make sure it meets those standards so all employees can be productive. Same with consumers. They want to be able to use your product. And inclusion, you want to develop the inclusion strategies and communication. So you want to allow people to build the knowledge, because knowledge is power. So earlier I said the 3 pillars were performance, security, and accessibility. So you need to consider those 3 pillars when you're developing best practice strategies to facilitate a bigger productivity, a greater inclusion, and a good foundation for communications. Okay, we have a picture here of a blind farmer who's going out to the barn to get a turkey for his dinner, but I don't think he's going to get far because the turkeys are going moo, and he's standing there with his axe and very confused. And that's the way we are on a lot of websites. We can see what's there, we can read what's there, but it's very confusing. So the first aspect of getting the interface correct is getting the message across. And there's 3 parts to that. Delivery, and usually it's through email or website. How are you delivering that? Can I actually receive it? Perceivability, can I perceive what's on the website? Is it just a picture? If it's a picture, I won't perceive the message. We have signals going on all around us, telephone, smartphone signals. We don't perceive them because you have to have a device to receive those. And understanding, if I can receive it, I can perceive it, and I can understand it, then I have knowledge. I can have power because I have knowledge. And that's the goal that you want to achieve. So don't stop there, though, because we said that the user interface is the starting point, but the other point at the end of the bridge is the user experience. And so you want to make sure that you develop a best practice strategy within your performance, security, and accessibility with 3 user experience qualities. Representation. You can represent information through pictures, text. You can represent information through announcements, talking, and what have you. Expression is very important. It's hard to read the mood in an email. So expression on your websites, the expression that you express, whether it's simple information or a complex information, it's all in how it's expressed that makes people connect. And finally, multiple means of engagement, which means make it adaptable, produce your product or service in a multiple way that I can adapt through mobile devices or on my laptop with a screen reader. But adaptability for large print is very important. Okay, so there's basically 4 ways of communicate. Face-to-face, of course, is the obvious. Beware of when you're communicating with people, the level of comfort. If you're talking with a blind person, you're interviewing it for a job, be aware of how people communicate face-to-face. So if you're, interviewing a blind person, possibly they're not looking at you, but that doesn't mean they're not listening, because people who have vision loss will pay attention by listening, not looking at you. Written communication, of course, is important for documents. It's got to be clearly and concise. They say 80% of what we learn is done through the visual cortex, which means we really depend on visual content in this world. However, verbal communications is probably the most prominent form of communications. And they say that although 80% of what we see is what we learn, 80% of what we retain is done through what we hear. So quite often they'll say, if you're trying to memorize something, read it out loud. Okay, so So we have gone through the inspiration phase. We got all the information we need. We know what we're going to base all of our best practice strategies on. We're going to move into the ideation phase. And here we need to close the gap. And the biggest gap we have is the gap between leaders that talk about and promote accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, and the management that have to implement it. Quite often we have such a large gap there. Quite often, like I can remember when I was working with IBM, project managers will be pulling their hair out because they got to get a project in on time and in budget. And I come along and say, I can't access the client documents. They're not in an accessible format. And, if project leaders are not prepared to deal with communication problems, with accessibility challenges, it can disrupt a whole project. And managers need to have the resources, the knowledge, and the time to implement the accessibility strategies that the leaders put in place. I can tell you that so often Ontario government has put out a program, a grant application, and the people that run it, that manage it, have no idea about the accessibility needs that are out there. Recently, the IDEA Fund was out online, and the website was not accessible. The grant that was sent to entrepreneurs had no information about the AODA requirements. There was no advisory backup to help with accessibility, digital communication strategies. So there's a gap there. The leaders have to understand what the entrepreneurs' needs are when it comes to implementing the requirements. And the developers and designers, of course, as I said, have a big challenge in making sure that everything is communicated through multiple means of adaptable equipment. And it can be a challenge if you're not given the tools and the backing that you need to have with regard to training. Okay. So design flaws are really the challenges. If there's a design flaw in your best practice strategy, then it automatically will eliminate some people. So you have to consider the performance, the security, and accessibility. Like a three-legged stool, you take one out, it's going to topple. Your business will not grow. So be sure to include accessibility in all of your plans. So for example, security is a big issue today. If you, and quite often it will conflict with accessibility. Your IT security people say, well, we can't implement that because it goes against the security. And you've got to be prepared to deal with those things. So if you have a sign in on your website and they say you have to use CAPTCHA, so what color is the bicycle in the picture? You automatically lose me right off the bat. So no matter what format you use, what model you use for development of your product and services, it can be human-centered design where you're designing for a specific purpose, or it can be universal and you're designing for a big audience, and then you build in the accessibility to attract the smaller market. In either case, you've got to be aware of the inclusive design qualities that need to be in that product design. So that, maybe you want to develop an AI stroller, a stroller that young parents can use that will help them. You take your hand off the handle and it automatically brakes, or it alerts you to any problems that it finds. And that kind of thing is for a universal need, but it could be adapted for other things. It could be adapted for grocery carts or maybe wheelchairs. So keep in mind that when you're developing a product or service, whether it's human-centered or universal design, it has to meet the inclusive guidelines. So you have your you have your performance, security, and accessibility, and your user interface is guided by the W3C standards: perceivability, operability, understandable, and robust. And then there's 3 levels: A, AA, and AAA. In Ontario, the legislation says that you must meet the AA standard. So what's the next step, though? You develop your infrastructure. You've got all the standards there, but is the website usable? And this is where the properties of human rights comes in. Countries around the world are developing legislation with human rights, and there's 4 categories that the United Nations Human Rights has developed. The first is dignity, and you want to move from information to knowledge. You want to make sure that your information is perceived and understood, because knowledge is power. Accessibility to usability is inclusive, is enabling. You want people to be enabled, and I think the greatest thing you can do is allow people to feel they're independent. So when you're developing digital communications, whether it's websites, emails, or what have you, accessibility is important, but usability is more important. If people can't use it, they don't understand it, they're not enabled. Integration is a difficult one for organizations, especially smaller organizations, to understand. And this is where you actually include. You want to be inclusive. And a good example of this is a lot of times government will have a project, and they will go to service organizations like March of Dimes or CNIB and say, we need advice on accessibility. Well, that's passive integration, because you're not including me, and I like to be active. So if you really want your customers, your consumers, to be part of your organization, they have to be active. So put something on your website, like a feedback form or something where they can engage you, that allows them to feel that they are an active participant. And the final thing is satisfaction. Everybody loves to be satisfied, and equality is the key here. And you've got to go from chaos to stability. And right now, we're in a bit of a state of chaos, because if you read reports about mental health and work and life balance, everybody's struggling. And I think one of the challenges that I have with this is that I really think our education system has let us down. Universities and colleges are producing engineers and computer scientists that have great creative minds and innovative ideas, but they have no idea about the end user experience. And they go out and they create all these great things that we struggle to use. So yeah, so the best customer is a satisfied customer, and creativity cannot be achieved without collaboration. So innovation and collaboration go together. Yeah, I like this quote, because you can show me a horse, you can show me the saddle and the riggings, that's great, but unless I get to ride the horse, I really don't experience it. And since I love motorcycles, if you have a motorcycle, don't show it to me, because I will want to experience it. The experience is what counts. People want to be satisfied. They don't want just to look at it, but they want to be. So, you got to consider all of the end user components in your bridge, your best practice strategy. So user experience, user design, the graphical user design, the content, and component design. They're all important in that bridge. Okay, and now the heavy part. Because there is so much going on in the world, and because we're becoming so dependent on digital communications, governments are developing legislation. The Accessibility with Canada Act has been implemented and is being rolled out. So if you're developing a small business, be sure to understand that criteria. Now, the important thing is that you don't have to know it in detail, because if you have community partners, you develop those partnerships with disabled groups or other organizations, it will come natural that you will just see it in your community and you will develop those things that are needed. And in Ontario, we currently have 5 standards, but you wouldn't know it. Unfortunately, a report came out, a review recently came out that indicated we are in really bad shape when it comes to implementing diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And here again, I say it's because we have a gap. We have the digital divide gap between leadership and management that are trying to implement all these things without the proper resources, skills, and knowledge. Okay, and finally, that's awareness. We went through a lot of stuff. I realized that, there's a lot there. And if anything, I hope you understand the concept of startups need to build a best practice strategy based on the principles of performance, security, and accessibility. And that bridge needs to have 2 points. You need to have the user experience, the user interface, and the user experience, which is often left out. There's 2 courses here that I'd recommend. CMS Solutions and ALWL has a more detailed course that you can take in understanding. So I encourage you to look at the courses, take courses, develop partnerships, and just like having an accountant on your team or a developer or a legal advisor, you need an accessibility specialist. And there are people that you can partnership with that will do that, will fill that role. The important thing is, though, is make sure that that accessibility specialist has user experience, because there's a lot of solutions out there that are misleading. And now that we're moving into the era of AI, there's a lot of companies pushing AI widgets that will make yourself accessible, your website accessible. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. So quick fix solutions, be very wary of those kind of propositions for your company, and actually develop partnerships and engage people. So now that you're aware, I encourage you to take the next step and engage people and then learn about the experience. So this is the part where we come to questions and answers, and I will hand it back to Emily.
Thank you so much, David. So I think our participants are going to walk away with a lot of useful information and tools to help ensure their business is as accessible as possible. So now we'll be moving into the Q&A portion of the event, where David will answer some questions from the audience. So just a reminder, there is the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to submit your questions there. The first question that was submitted is, if I can only do one thing to improve accessibility in my organization, what would that be?
One thing is avoid the condition of willful blindness. far too often, as I said, we have a gap between leaders and managers. Far too often, leaders are under so much pressure in, trying to build the business or getting things done that they take a stance of willful blindness and they just hand it off to management and say, you do it. And I suggest that if you have a small business, try to be aware, try to engage people. You want to develop digital communications, will become more aware of how people do that and talk to partners or talk to staff and see what their challenges are. Because, procurement, for example, I can't tell you how many times a company has a diversity inclusion program and their procurement department goes off and buys a tool and there's employees that can't use it. And it's simply because of awareness. So the biggest thing you can do is become aware and be willing to take the step to engage people.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that answer. And we have another question here. Should an applicant disclose disabilities prior to an interview?
They shouldn't have to. They can. I always do, because when I walk into a room, it's quite obvious. So quite often people will not disclose because it closes the door before you even get there. It depends on the situation, whether you should or not. Depends on, how confident you are in yourself. It depends on who is the company you're applying to. But the answer really is no, you should not have to disclose, because what you're doing is you're hiring the talent, not the limitations that person might have. Because if you've developed a best practice, you will be able to overcome those limitations with the accessibility strategies that you've put in place.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Another question, are there any emerging trends or technologies in the field of accessibility that startups should be aware of and consider integrating into their products or services?
There is so much going on today. Any product or services that you develop and that you will integrate into your products, because everything seems to be integrated these days, just make sure that they can handle multiple formats. It's adaptable to be able to use a braille display, or it's able to use a eye pointer, head pointer, eye gazer, whatever they call them. But if you develop the products with accessibility standards, the W3 standards, those things should fit in automatically. And then you got to make sure that they are usable. So, I would say be very careful with AI. There's a lot of great stuff out there. One of the way we learn today is through interactive games. The game market is huge. So if you're developing a product and you want people to be able to learn how to use your product, maybe you'll develop sort of a smartphone app that will allow them to engage. So, that is something to be aware of. And that's a great tool, but it has to be accessible. It has to have visual, audible, and tactile components so that it is something that everybody can use. So I would just say, develop partnerships that have good standards, good baseline of best practices, and build your products with that. Don't go with these companies that promise, things that simply are too good to be true.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Another question is, how can startups effectively communicate the value of accessibility to potential investors or stakeholders who may not be familiar with its importance?
That is a challenge. That's a big challenge, because one of our biggest problems is attitude. And as soon as you mention the word accessibility, it strikes up fear. I know I've done a lot of workshops with software developers, and you mention the word accessibility, and they start pulling their hair out because, it seems such an overwhelming task, but it doesn't have to be. And you need to be able to allow people to take time to learn to do it. So investors want a return on their investment. That's the key. So you need to be able to identify the fact that your product and services is meeting the accessible standards, not only through the digital standards of communications, but it's meeting the human rights standards of legislation. And that alone means that you're getting the talent, because there's a lot of hidden talent out there. Believe me, there's a lot of people with disabilities that have master's degrees, PhDs, that are unable to get a job because of the interview process, the systemic challenges. So you can show them that with this best practice strategies that you're putting into your big idea, that you can attract top talent. And not only that, but you can reach the marginalized markets. You can reach people with disabilities. You can reach the aging population. And that's what investors want to hear, is they want to hear, how can your company grow? And if your company doesn't have accessibility built in, automatically, globally, you're over 1 billion people you're cutting out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the next question that we have is from Valerie, and she asks, is there any certification for accessibility services?
Oh dear. Yes and no. The thing about certification is it's only valid in the eyes of the beholder. So if I go to university or college and get a degree, do you recognize it? Well, if it's a recognized college or university, yes. Unfortunately, in Canada, we don't have any recognized certification for digital accessibility specialists like myself. There are some organizations that are developing certification. The challenge we have is that everybody's got a different idea as to what accessibility is. And the certification programs that are out there, some of them are developed by companies that are in the business to make money. They're a company that they're set up and designed for the purpose of making money. So yes, they have certification programs. And are they good? Possibly they're good. I can't really say what's good and bad because it depends on what you want to learn. And then there's other organizations, nonprofit and maybe government, that are attempting to set up certification programs. And their perspective is totally different. It comes from a different point of view. So the short answer is no, there's really no standard certification program. However, there are some out there that you can take. You can go and get that certification, and it will probably do you good, because companies do like to see certification. So whether it's of great value in my eyes or your neighbor's eyes, doesn't matter. If the employer thinks it's value, then go for it.
Perfect. Thank you. And our next question is, can you provide examples of successful tech startups or companies that have prioritized accessibility and the positive impact it had on their business?
Well, there's a lot of, I work mostly with small business and startup entrepreneurs. And I can say, yes, there's been some successful groups. There's a lot of great application, like especially smartphone applications. For example, GPS tracking. Now, when you're driving, GPS tells you where to go and that. But for me, when I'm walking, a GPS tracking device is very different. I want to know what's around me. I want to know who's there. And this is where AI is becoming really, really valuable in helping me to use my smartphone in identifying what's around me and what the stores are, what the streets are, what the directions. But there is some apps. There are some very successful small businesses out there that have developed these apps that I use. But the big ones that probably everybody knows about is probably companies like Apple. Apple was the very first company that came out with a smartphone that I could walk into the store, pick it up off the shelf and start using it. I didn't have to load a screen reader. I didn't have to load, I just turned it on like anybody else. And that's the first company, I think, that probably, turned the light bulb on, as you say, that accessibility, usability, what makes people happy and satisfied is the usability experience. Another big success, of course, is the Google. I mean, everybody uses Google, and it started from a small group and now is quite large. And the invention, as I said, from a human-centered or universal point of view doesn't matter, but the invention of the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee, he established the hypertext format. And so, that was a small proposition. And look today, I mean, everybody uses the internet. Actually, that was a universal kind of thought, big idea, but today it's a huge thing in the lives of people with disabilities. The invention of the printing press enabled people to become educated. The invention of the World Wide Web to blind people is like the printing press to the sighted world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our next question is from Sebastian, and he says, thanks for the presentation, David, very informative. In regards to the quick fix widgets for websites, do you have any specifics on where they have gaps?
Where they have gaps. They have gaps when it comes to assistive technology. There are companies that will put a widget on your website and it links to their servers that have AI capability. And what it does is it comes in and it sort of reformats your website. The problem is a lot of what it does already is done by the operating system. The operating systems and the browsers allow you to maximize and minimize text, allows you to change size, allows you to use dark mode and light mode. So that's what these widgets do. They try to allow the user to customize your website to their need. However, where it falls short is in the needs of assistive technologies. Screen readers are extremely powerful tools for blind people. It's sort of it lies in the background, and it's sort of like spyware, I guess, because it tells me everything that comes up on the screen, and it tells me everything that's typed. And these widgets actually cause barriers for screen reader users, because screen readers will create a accessibility tree. They take the browser builds a document object model, and the browser also builds an accessibility tree beside it. And so the screen reader uses that information, and the more accessible you make your website, the better interface the screen reader has with your browser. The widgets will try to override that. They try to make things the way they think the screen should look, how the screen reader should act. And as of today, they are more of a problem than a help for people that use assistive technologies like braille display, screen readers, eye gazers, puff and sift, special hand tremor mouse. Those kind of things are not accommodated.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, David, for all those amazing answers to those questions. And thank you so much for your presentation today. And I'm going to pass it off to Jen now.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you so much, David. If anyone is watching and you didn't get a question answered, we encourage you to follow up with David Best on his socials. Another big thank you to David for this very informative workshop. It was an absolute pleasure to have you with us today virtually. And just before we say goodbye, a reminder to follow WEtech Alliance on our social media or log on to wetech-alliance.com/events for more information about all our upcoming events, including virtual and in person. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and we hope you've enjoyed today's session. A big thank you again to Leanne from EPICentre, as well as Emily Robach from WEtech Alliance for helping us with the back end of event production today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.